Well, why is it why is it coming up all the time now? We're hearing it in our business environments, in our
Hmm.
communities, and our organizations,
Hmm.
churches, etc.
Hmm.
Why is it rising to the surface now? What's going on?
I think it's so powerful. And I've talked to a lot of people who have received diagnoses late in life, right? And suddenly you start to understand things about your way of being that were otherwise perhaps shameful or frustrating to you. And um, I wrote down a quote from, I was watching a news anchor the other morning who had been diagnosed with ADHD recently, and she said, um, to under to begin to understand that these things about me that I've struggled with are not character flaws, but they're just differences in the way my brain works.
Hmm.
So I think that an appreciation, so, moving away from this one size fits all model of how people think, process information, decide, and operate in the world toward an understanding of all of the different ways that we make sense and
Hmm.
operate in the world around us is really important. And in
Right.
these kind of cases that are either rare or that are not fitting with our culture, our common work culture. And I think
Hmm.
it's really important to talk about the role of culture and this dysfunction and atypicality.
Hmm.
But people who are finding that the demands expected of them don't match the way their brains work are finding a lot of they're feeling very empowered by understanding that their brain is what's making this hard for them. I'm really excited about that because I think there's space for that in our inclusion efforts of all types.
Hmm.
I think that many of the things that you can do to create a trusting and safe work environment will help people whose brains don't work like the typical brain find opportunities to discuss strengths and accommodations and so forth and so on. So and again, if this is could be true of 1 in 5 of your employees or 1 in 10 of your employees, like how much more, how much richer can your environment be if you start to acknowledge that there's a match between the demands we place on our brains
Right.
and the way our brains work
Hmm.
that we're not considering oftentimes. We're doing a one size fits all work
Yeah.
environment as
Yeah.
well.
Right. So that brings up a great question, which you alluded to earlier, which is kind of workplace culture and how this all fits in. So, like, what would if I'm a manager, if I'm in a leadership role, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, how do I begin to contextualize all this in a way that
Mm-hmm.
will help me be better, and
Mm-hmm.
more effective at work, and to help my team also be more effective?
Right. I think the first thing is to acknowledge that our default, the way our social human brains understand others is through mirroring. So our instinctive way of processing social signals is to simulate our brains. So if I see you reach for something, the part of my brain that reaches for something in that same way activates. And I understand your behavior through the lens of my brain.
Hmm.
Now, we're learning more and more through social neuroscience that in the wild, people gravitate towards others whose brains work like theirs. You can predict who's going to be friends with one another based on the similarities between how their brains work. It's easier if I'm simulating you, it's easier for me to get it right. I'm reverse engineering you. I only
Mhm.
have observables. It's
Yeah.
easier for me to get it right if that instinctive way of understanding others matches. And so I'm like, oh, if I was doing that, this is how I would feel, or this is where I would be. However, our human brains, we are social animals. And I think this is so important because when you're put in front of someone as a manager whose brain works like yours, you're going to think that person is better. You're going to think they make better choices, they have better ideas. But we evolved different sense making systems. The reason that these different ways of being are happening in 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 brains is because they have compensatory strengths in the wild. Maybe
Mhm.
not in the workplace, but in the wild. For instance, there's a whole book called The Dyslexic Advantage that talks about dyslexia arises because the right hemisphere of the brain is not shrunken in people with dyslexia. In typically developing people, we have a sort of physical limitation in the right hemisphere that sends language and sort of expert fast processing systems to our left. This gives many dyslexic people advantage in systems level processing, engineering, seeing the big picture. And so understanding that we evolved different ways of being because we evolved to solve problems in groups. Group formation that acknowledges and embraces this neurodiversity is really advantageous. In fact, there's a researcher at Carnegie Mellon, I believe her last name is Woolley. It's either Woolley or Woolette, but she has studied group functioning. She's created these tests that assess something like general IQ for groups.
Okay.
And she randomly assigns a group, puts them through a whole bunch of paces, many different kinds of problem solving, and then measures how well they function. She has been working on predictors of success in the groups. It has nothing to do with individual intelligence. It has nothing to do with the average intelligence of the group, the maximum intelligence of the person on the team. What it has to do with is our ability to reverse engineer the other minds on the team. So theory of mind, instead of just simulating, your ability to say, given these observables, what are the states that make sense for what's going on inside this person? Like the skill with which you can understand others is what drives team success. So I think just starting out by knowing how brains can be different,
right,
and how those differences have different matches with the environment is really important for sort of, you know, even one-on-one mentoring, but also for like formulation and supporting teams with minds that work differently.
right, okay.